agreed to offer Zen pointers for us. How can we embody our Zen practice in a concrete way in this troubled world of ours, especially in the light of the ecological crisis and now with COVID hanging around us, threatening us with impending death. David and I have been sitting together for a good number of years, ever since the 1970s and 80s in Kamakura, Japan, and we continue to communicate, and I learned so much from him. So it's a great joy. If you want to know more about David, just Google him and you'll find a lot. He has a webpage with all of his writings, so I won't go into that. So David, please share with us your wisdom.
Before the talk, we will recite or chant boundless compassion.
Boundless compassion, absorbing the sounds awaken the Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call this, in the dark we call this. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this absorbing world. Sounds awakens and Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call this, in the dark we call this. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this absorbing world. Sounds awakens a Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light we call this, in the dark we call this. Moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing but this.
Thank you, dear friend Ruben, and I see Maria in the background. I really appreciate this invitation, this opportunity to talk about, frankly, things that I think are on the minds of all of us these days. Ruben, in your introduction, you already referred to, the incredible situation we find ourselves in. Could any of us have imagined at the beginning of this year everything that was going to happen? And so inevitably, I mean, one of the really important issues, given our practice, given our engagement with the Buddhist tradition, we inevitably want to know what is it that our Zen practice can offer that can help us understand this. I'm reminded of two of my favorite Zen stories. One of them is where the student asks the master, what should we do when difficult times come? And the master simply says, and it's kind of hard to do it on Zoom, welcome, welcome. In other words, our path isn't about avoiding difficult times, and that's certainly our situation today. The second story that I think is so relevant is where, and it's actually one of the koans, as I remember, the student asked the master, what's the constant activity of all the bodhisattvas and mahasattvas? In other words, what is it that awakened people are doing all the time, day by day, moment by moment? And the response is responding appropriately. But how do we do that? How do we respond appropriately to such an extraordinary situation, like nothing I've faced in my lifetime before, and I'm not that young. I mean, I think there's a lot of things within the Buddhist tradition we could point to, but the one that I want to focus on this morning is the Bodhisattva Path, which frankly I think is the most important in terms of the kind of guidance it gives us. I suppose I'd like to call it the new Bodhisattva Path, because I think we need to expand the usual understanding in certain ways, which I will get into in a moment. So, you know, given time limitations, what I'd like to focus on are what I consider to be the three most important aspects of the Bodhisattva Path, which can, again, help us understand and respond appropriately. The first one is the fact that bodhisattvas have a double practice, or if you will, a two-sided practice. And I think that's really important to clarify, because, you know, so often we have fallen into the trap of thinking, you know, real practice, real Buddhist or Zen or spiritual practice is what's going on when we're sitting on our cushions. And to be actually engaged in the world is somehow a distraction from it. And I think the whole point of the Bodhisattva path is the realization that that's not true, that actually to be engaged in the world is just as important a part of our spiritual path, our practice, as anything that's going on in the cushion. And in fact, I think it sort of flows naturally out of it. Didn't say that very well. I think that as we get more deeply into our own personal meditation practice, and as we begin to realize and open up and feel our non-duality with other people and the rest of the world, I think engagement with the world is kind of a natural thing to follow. I'm reminded of something Franz Kafka said in one of his letters, which I think is very pointed. He said, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do. But perhaps this very holding back, your holding back, is the one suffering you could avoid." Let me say that again. You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do, but perhaps your holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. Why? Because we're not separate from those sufferings. And by holding back, we reinforce the fundamental problem, the fundamental sense of separation. We reinforce the delusion that my well-being is separate from the well-being of other people. One of my all-time favorite quotations is actually by an Indian teacher, a Neo-Vedantin named Nisargadatta, who said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." And those are the two pillars of the Buddhist path, right? Wisdom and love, or as we usually say, wisdom and compassion. And what I love about that is that it shows so clearly the relationship between them, right? I mean, love or compassion, it's not a feeling, it's a way of being in the world. It's a way of living in the world in an engaged way, concerned about the sufferings of others, because we realize that we're not separate from those people, that there is no separate self ultimately. When we come to something like Zen practice, I mean, naturally, at the beginning, I think there's a certain kind of self-preoccupation, right? Why do we spend all this time, energy, sometimes money, you know, sitting in our butts, aching legs and backs and so forth? We do it because there's some dukkha, there's some suffering, there's some discomfort in our lives, whether it's physical pain, or maybe just a kind of existential angst about what it's all about. But the irony is that although we might start in that way, what we ultimately begin to realize as we get more and more deeply into it, that it's the kind of self-preoccupation that's really the fundamental problem. And as we begin to realize that this is the kind of point I'm trying to make, that engagement in the world is a natural kind of follow-up. But even more than that, when I think back to the beginnings of my own Zen practice, say at the Maui Zendo with, say, Robert Aiken, you know, we were sitting pretty hard. It was like 4 hours a day for, you know, pretty long stretches, months. And frankly, it wasn't that difficult to sort of have little experiences, openings, insights. Frankly, what I found more difficult, though, was finding ways to integrate those insights into how I actually related to other people and how I actually lived in the world. That was the greater challenge, because just because we have some insight into our true nature, it doesn't mean that our deeply rooted, mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting, they don't just automatically disappear. How are they transformed? Well, we have to get out there and we have to create these new habits by living in ways that are not so self-preoccupied. I think we sometimes have a kind of romantic myth about, you know, somebody like Milarepa in his cave. You sort of go into a cave and you meditate for 40 years or 60 years, whatever, then you come out fully enlightened. And I don't think it works like that, really. I'm reminded of something Joanna Macy said. The world has a role to play in our awakening, right? That actually our engagement with the world is part of our own personal transformation. Or to say it another way, when bodhisattvas act, when they are engaged, the person who benefits most from that engagement is the bodhisattva herself. Anyway, we could go on and on about that, but I think that's the basic point, that it's this realization that our practice isn't simply about our own, what's happening to our own minds when we're sitting on our cushions, but that it involves something much more, that it naturally flows as we begin to realize into concern and into searching and finding ways to engage what's happening in the world. But that brings me to the second point. What is it exactly that we engage with? And this is where I would focus on the new, why I sometimes talk about the new Bodhisattva path. Because I think that due to the history of Buddhism, the focus has very much been on individual transformation, and even in the case of Bodhisattva activity, individuals helping other individuals. Actually, when I go back to the earliest texts, and when I read the Pali Canon, it seems pretty clear to me that the Buddha was pretty progressive in a number of ways. In fact, and here's the point, more progressive than the institution that developed after he died. I mean, if you look at his attitude toward women, the way he created a Bhikkhuni Sangha, if you look at his attitude toward caste, the fact that when you join the Sangha, you lose all caste. I mean, I think he had a kind of progressive vision about where society might actually move. It wasn't just that he was trying to create a refuge from that, but as some people have argued, he actually was maybe offering a model or new possibilities that might be integrated into society as a whole. But in any case, the way the tradition developed, and maybe this is how it survived so well, was that it didn't challenge the social order, it didn't challenge the kings or emperors. In fact, it wanted their support. So the emphasis has been very much on whatever dukkha, whatever suffering there is in my life, it's due to my own mind, the way my own mind works, and to my own karma. And if there's a problem in my life, don't blame anybody else, right? I still remember hearing a teacher say, and that teacher will remain nameless, but kind of reflecting, oh, what terrible karma all of those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born at that time in that place. And that's just unacceptable today, you know, blaming the victim in that way. We know too much about social forces. We know too much about how people can end up suffering, not because of anything they've done or anything that they are, but being in the wrong place at the right time, or I guess should say, the wrong time. So we need to expand our understanding of dukkha. The Buddha said all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. And the Four Noble Truths are all about dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, how to end dukkha. But I think one of the important implications of the kind of challenges that we're facing today is the realization that dukkha is much broader, and we have to find ways to address, to understand and address what we might call social dukkha or institutionalized dukkha. My sense about the what's happened over the past generation or so in American Buddhism is that I think we've become a lot better in appreciating the importance of sort of engagement, but engagement in the sense of individuals, maybe helping homeless people, prison dharma, hospice work, and so forth. I think all of these have become important in for lots of Zen groups. But to say it another way, I think we've become a lot better maybe at pulling drowning people out of the river, but we're not much better in asking who or what is pushing so many more people into the river upstream. What are the social forces, the way our economy, our society, our political system is organized? What is it that's actually causing the kinds of the great increase in homelessness, for example, or the huge prison population we have now, right? So another way to say this, of course, is that the Buddha, he didn't talk about evil, he talked about the three poisons, which could be translated as greed, ill will, delusion. And as I've argued, sometimes I think we need to appreciate how we have institutionalized them, right? If greed means you never have enough, if we look at our economic system, an economic system that feeds on consumerism, consumers never consume enough, or corporations that always need to grow, more profit, more market share, higher stock value, they're never high enough. But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough, right? Isn't this the real definition of greed? If you look at ill will, well, we've got some pretty obvious examples. I mean, institutionalized ill will, what about racism? We could also look at the militarism of our country, by far the wealthiest. I mean, if measured in terms of the amount of resources that we devote to our military, we are by far and away the most militarized society in human history. And then third, institutionalized dukkha. Well, again, not just fake news, but even before that, the fact that the media are corporations that make money not from educating us or informing us, but from finding ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder. In other words, advertising. I mean, I think these are three classic kind of examples of institutionalized three poisons, and therefore institutionalized dukkha. And I think we're in a situation now where, we have to find ways to address them. And finally, the third aspect of the Bodhisattva path that I'd really like to emphasize today, which is that, and I think this kind of follows naturally if you think about it, the Bodhisattva path doesn't tell us what to do, but it has a great deal to say about how we do it, right? Whatever it is that we decide to do. I mean, the Buddha, he lived in a very different time and place 2,400 years ago in Iron Age India, right? He didn't face the kind of problems we do now with fossil fuel and increasing carbon levels in the atmosphere, or extinction events, or plastic in the oceans. I mean, we can't expect the Buddha to give us specific answers. It'd be wonderful if we could just go back to the Pali Canon and read off what we should do. But for the Buddha and for all of the Asian Buddhist societies, all of which are pre-modern, none of which faced our kinds of problems, it's obviously very inappropriate to expect that they could give us specific answers. But what the Bodhisattva path does do is tell us a great deal about how to do it. And some of this, I think most of us are very familiar with, the idea of the 6 or 10 paramitas, sort of traits, characteristics that we should develop within ourselves. There's a number of things, too many to mention, or to go into. Let me just mention a couple. I mean, one of them is remembering that for Buddhism, the fundamental duality or issue is not good versus evil. And therefore, the path of social engagement is not about identifying and trying to destroy evil people, reinforcing that kind of duality, but rather for Buddhism, it's more delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus awakening. You know, that we're all part of some webs of ignorance and delusion. And although we may well need to forcefully stop what certain people are doing at certain times, non-violently, according to the Buddhist principles of not harming, nonetheless, it's not about labeling people as evil, but, you know, acknowledging the fundamental problem is helping us wake up individually and helping our society wake up. The other thing that really stands out for me is the fundamental pragmatism of the Buddhist tradition. I mean, I love this. I love the fact that the Buddha compared his teachings, his Dharma, to a raft that we use to ferry across the river of life and death to the other shore, right? To awakening. And, you know, having done that, you don't look at the raft and say, ah, that's been a really good raft. I'm going to pick it up and carry it around on my back everywhere I go. That's brilliant, right? Buddhist teachings aren't revealed scripture for us to sort of put on an altar. It's not the word of God. Buddhist teachings are like a guidebook or a roadmap that we use to go somewhere, to use to transform ourselves, and hopefully to find ways to transform society as well. And so this kind of pragmatism, I think, can be very important as far as avoiding a kind of dogmatism that can so easily concerns about social justice, or how it is we should respond to the kinds of situations we face today. I think the emphasis on pragmatism, can be really, really important. But let me conclude by focusing on what to me sort of stands out most about the Bodhisattva Path, and that I think we should highlight. That bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. Let me say that again. Bodhisattvas act without attachments to the results of what they do. It's interesting, the Buddha says in the Pali Canon that one characteristic of an awakened person is that their actions are nirasa, which can be translated without expectation, or even without hope. And you find something similar in other places in the Buddhist tradition. In the Tibetan Lojong tradition, for example, it gives a classic formulation: abandon any hope of fruition. Don't get caught up in how you're going to be in the future. Stay in the present moment. Interesting. And also, it's not only Buddhist. I mean, for some of us, this is a very important principle, one of the most important principles in the Bhagavad Gita, the emphasis on karma yoga, action, one's action as one of the paths for spiritual transformation. The emphasis there being, you're right. Your responsibility is to the work, never to the fruits, not to the results, right? Nonetheless, non-attachment to the results can be easily misunderstood. It can encourage a kind of casual attitude, especially when we remember the Buddhist emphasis on motivation, right? Motivation in creating karma. We might think, all that's important is my motivation pure, and it doesn't matter if it has any sort of result or not. And I think that's a really dangerous misunderstanding. So let me finish by just briefly pointing to 3 aspects of this non-attachment to result that I think can be very helpful to us. One of them is maybe well exemplified by the distinction we might make between running a 100-meter dash and a marathon, right? When you run a 100-meter dash, the only thing that matters is getting to the other end as quickly as possible. You don't have time to think about anything else. But you can't run a marathon that way, right? You'll burn yourself out very quickly. The idea of a marathon, and again, I'm not a marathon runner myself, but I've talked to friends, including Zen friends who have, and they emphasize what you would expect, that when you run a marathon, you can't keep focusing on the goal. Rather, yeah, you're running in a certain direction, but what's important is to be right here, right now. Just this step, just this step, just this step. And in fact, you know, Japanese has this term, tada, just this. In fact, the Sanskrit has the term tatha, just this, the Tathagata, the Buddha, the one who just comes and the one who just goes. So in other words, the emphasis on, yeah, we can be working toward a goal, but we can also be focused on what, in fact, we need to be focused on right here and now, with the understanding that by doing that, then we're moving in that direction. I think Thich Nhat Hanh maybe say something about washing dishes the same way, right? You can wash dishes quickly to get to the end because your TV show's about to start, or you can wash dishes just to wash dishes. The result is the same. A second aspect of this non-attachment to results, I think is kind of built into the Bodhisattva vows that we, you know, the 4 Bodhisattva vows that we take so often in the Zendo, right? The first one, sentient beings or living beings are numberless, I vow to save them all. Wow, if we think about that, what are we doing? We're literally taking a vow to do something that's not possible. And it's not a contradiction. In fact, that's the point, that the whole point of the Bodhisattva vow, it's not to achieve something. It's not as though you are going to come to the end of having saved every living being in the cosmos, right? Rather, what it really points to is a reorientation of the meaning of our lives, away from our usual sort of self-preoccupation, what's in it for me, to, okay, I'm not separate from other people. My well-being isn't separate from the well-being of others in the world. What can I do to make this a better place for everyone, right? So we act. We do the best we can. Sometimes we're successful, great. That doesn't mean we've got to the end. No, we just continue on. Okay, there's something else to do. There's always something else to do. Or we're somehow stuck, it doesn't work out. Well, again, we pick ourselves up, we continue, or maybe we find another way to approach it. The point of the Bodhisattva Path is non-attachment to results, because there's no end to that process. In fact, it's wonderful because, how to say it? I think I say it here somewhere better. So, it's a new way of being in the world rather than a way of trying to accomplish anything in particular, right? Once we realize our non-duality with other people and with this magnificent planet, we don't want to live in any other way, right? And someone, maybe this is the real point, someone who has volunteered for this kind of job is not going to be intimidated by any of the problems that we're facing today, including the fact that we seem to be self-destructing as a civilization. We've already volunteered for a job that's literally impossible. This is just another aspect of it, right? But let me end by spending a little time on what I see as maybe, how to say it? I'm trying to say that it's this third aspect that I find most powerful, the one that I want to go into now. And I think it's maybe important to realize this one in the light of our situation. I mean, even if we just look at the ecological, anybody following what's going on in northern Siberia these days, the heat wave? Anybody realize what that means in terms of melting permafrost and so forth? Let's be frank, our ecological situation is not good, and it's not getting better. Just because there's been a very slight economic downturn doesn't mean that somehow the carbon crisis, the climate emergency is solved. We just don't know. We just don't know what's going to happen, and we just don't know what's possible. But the wonderful thing about Zen is this emphasis on don't know mind, because whereas, and for many people in many situations, not knowing could be something really paralyzing, in the sense that, we don't know what to do, we feel shut down. Whereas I think in Zen, the emphasis on don't know mind is an essential part of our practice. We don't know what's possible. We don't really know that much what's actually going on right here and now, you see. One of my early teachers, Robert Aiken in Hawaii, he liked to say that our path isn't about clearing up the mystery, but making the mystery clear, right? I mean, in our practice, it's not as though we have these moments when suddenly I now understand everything about the world and myself and how we fit together and so forth. It's much more opening up to a kind of mystery, and a mystery that includes ourselves. And bodhisattvas open up to this mystery and are taken by it, right? We access the mystery not by grasping at it, to rest in it, but rather in being taken by it, and thereby our activities manifest something greater than our egos. What am I trying to point to here? The activity of the bodhisattva goes beyond optimism and beyond hope. Both of those are dualistic ways of thinking, right? Optimism, pessimism. I'm reminded of my favorite definition of a pessimist, somebody who had to live with an optimist. And we can say something like that about hope too. If what you do is motivated by hope, then you're always going to be shadowed or dogged by the possibility of despair, because those two, they always go together. Hope of something happening is also the possibility that it won't, right? So in the case of the bodhisattva, bodhisattvas are motivated by something deeper than that. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, he put it well. He said, hope, well, he redefined hope. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, regardless of how it turns out. Wendell Berry, the great poet and essayist, said something similar. He said, we don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it, right? What all this does is, for me, points to the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results, which is this. And frankly, this is the most important thing in my mind that I have to say today. Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be, not knowing if our efforts will make any difference whatsoever. Let me say that again. Our task, our job, we are challenged to do the very best we can, not knowing if it's going to make any difference whatsoever. Have we already passed ecological tipping points and we're doomed? We don't know, again, don't know mind, but that's okay. Of course, we hope our efforts will bear fruit. We do try to think strategically. We're not just gesturing symbolically. We're trying to do something, but we also acknowledge that we can't control what the result will be. And with regard to our ecological activities, we could say that what we do is our gift to the earth. And like every real gift, it's gratis. You don't give a gift in order to get something in return. A real gift is given freely. If you want something back, it's not really a gift, is it? And that's the same thing about our activity today. We can't know if what we do is important, but it's important for us to do it. There's a famous phrase in the Jewish tradition about tikkun olam, the work of healing the world. It's not your responsibility to finish the work, but neither are you free to put it down, right? The point here being, Non-attachment to results is really difficult, you know, but that's the whole point of our practice. That's why the two sides of the Bodhisattva path, that we continue on our own practice, finding our own equanimity, our own serenity, realizing our own emptiness. By grounding ourselves in that and continuing to do so, continuing to work on our own transformation, that gives us the ground thereby where we can go out and do the very best we possibly can, not knowing what the result will be. I think it's really, really hard to do that unless one has that kind of spiritual grounding. Of course, to act completely without expectation of results. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, this is an ideal, and, you know, inevitably, I think we're going to fall short of that sometimes, but that's okay. Our job isn't to be perfect. It's to do the very best we can. And in accord with our practice, picking ourselves up and, you know, going forward and doing the very best we can again. In conclusion, frankly, I wonder if at this point in history, the earth and indeed our societies now too, are they all calling upon us all to become ecosattvas and bodhisattvas? Sometimes it seems to me that if Buddhists don't want to do this or can't do this, then Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. But what I've tried to point out this morning is that there is this, I think, really powerful spiritual resource, in particular, this double path of the Bodhisattva, that is exactly what the world needs today. Or so I think. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Just turn on your video or start video.
Do we have a little time for questions? Is that appropriate or not?
But let us end first with just 3 vows altogether.
Okay. I hope what I said came through. Did it make sense? Was it clear?
David, I was just gonna ask you, would you rather that people write their question on the chat mode, or would you rather that they raise their hand?
It's a good question. Raising hands is fine as long as people can keep it really concise. Sometimes what happens is it becomes a very long issue. So, but it's also more alive that way. So if we can ask people to speak and focus, I think that's better.
All right. So some guidelines again. Just go to participants and then click on that, and you'll see a raise hand like this. Click on that, and then you can unmute yourself as soon as I call your name. So right now we have Jean.
Hello, this is Jean from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. My question is, how important do you think it is to first have some insights into our true nature before going out and engaging the world? Or do you think doing these things in parallel, it sounds like, is what you said, for one to enable the other?
Great question. You know, one of the problems I think in the past is we've rationalized the idea that it's important for me to sort of really focus on my cushion and come to really great, you know, be really, really clear, have really deep insight or awakening before I'm able to go back and become engaged in the world. And, you know, I think that can easily rationalize never getting around to become engaged. I think I think there's a reciprocal thing here, that our engagement, we should do what we can according to what we understand, according to what's available now. And what I see is a kind of a back and forth, in the sense of, you know, our engagement will help our insight will help our engagement. So that relationship is very important. The other thing I would emphasize too, I mean, it sounds, you might think from what I said that it's important to keep this kind of harmony or balance between the personal and the engagement. And just speaking from my own life, what I find is it's more of a cycle, that there are times when I'm really focused on, say, meditation retreats and really working on the meditative. And then times like now, when it's really important to be engaged. And so I see that as kind of a yin and a yang. So it doesn't mean that we always have to be keeping them completely balanced at every moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's my perspective anyway. Thank you.
Next we have Sat Qatar.
Hello, thanks for the talk. It's wonderful. I had a question about the no expectations. And so thinking about that one, I just want to see if you would agree that it's doing without any expectation for the small self, the separate self, my family, my loved ones, my community. And then it's kind of a mystery, like you said, that it's like love is blind, so compassion is blind, or is it? Somehow intuitively, we know how to express compassion, even though we can't see, what the outcome will be. But see where I'm going with it? Get into the question.
To be honest, I had a lot of trouble hearing your question. I think you're having some sound issues. The one thing that I would emphasize is the acting without expectation, it doesn't mean we don't be as strategic as possible. In other words, I think it's really important to be as clear as we can about what the situation is and what we can do to intervene in hopefully an effective way. It's like we're working for change, right? Like here in Colorado, fracking is a huge issue. I want to stop fracking along with a lot of other people. So when I think about what to do there, I try to be clear about what's actually most likely to have an effect. But the point about no expectation is more, despite that I do the best I can, that doesn't guarantee anything. At a certain point, it's out of my hands. So I think that's the important issue. Now, given that I couldn't hear you very clearly, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question there.
Thank you. That helps provide some clarification.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Mary Helen has raised her hand, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was really interested in your metaphor of switching or seeing ourselves, not just pulling people out of the stream, but questioning what upstream is pushing them into the stream as really something that's very memorable. How does this look when we move beyond our personal cushion and the Sangha to dealing with social dukkha? I mean, how can that be done in an awakened way that doesn't inspire pushback?
Great question. I mean, a basic problem for those of us Zen practitioners is that helping a homeless person can be pretty, essentially quite simple. If you're at a homeless shelter or, a kitchen or something, or helping somebody on the street, Whereas when we get to these larger questions of the ways institutions are structured and how they're causing dukkha, it's harder to avoid something that we're often trying to avoid in our practice, conceptualizing, right? It's like, you know, we have to ask some pretty deep and tough questions about why society isn't working and what changes might be needed in order to make it work. And so a fundamental problem for Zen practitioners is we're kind of uncomfortable going there. And I think it's a real challenge of our maturity. In the early stages, as Yamada Roshi said, you know, concepts are the problem when we're meditating, but ultimately they're not the problem, they're not bad. What we're trying to do in our practice is not get rid of thinking or concepts, but to think more deeply, to think more non-dually, to think more creatively. I think Dogen said something to the effect, the goal is not to get rid of concepts, but to liberate concepts. So that I think is the real challenge, looking at the social structure and social theory, as it were, from a Buddhist perspective. Yeah, yeah. Now, as far as avoiding pushback, I mean, to some degree, I think there is a little bit of benefit from the point I made about not seeing the world in terms of good and evil people, right? Realizing our non-duality, even with people we don't like, even with people we're working against, right? I'm thinking about Gandhi in India. He never trashed the English people. He was educated in London. He knew and appreciated English culture. And that's why he believed sooner or later they were going to walk out, because they were small and they had to. He treated them always with respect, but forcefully. And I think, although this is not going to avoid all problems by any means, but if we treat those that we're disagreeing with respectfully, maybe going back to the Christian distinction between hating the sin but loving the sinner, then I think to some degree that may help us avoid some of the negative pushback. I mean, it's so sad, the culture wars. It's so sad the way the pandemic has gotten plugged into the culture wars, right? And so much in the culture wars is, you know, us versus them. And hopefully the Buddhist emphasis on non-duality would help us see through getting locked into that kind of a tribalism. Yeah. That's all I can say. Thank you.
We have Katie.
Hi, David. I loved your talk. I also loved your books that I've read. And this question I have comes from being a psychologist and working with people who have internal suffering. And I struggle, I haven't been a psychologist that long. I practiced Zen before I started to become a psychologist. So I struggle with this whole idea of just letting the suffering, like internal stuff, don't be preoccupied with your stuff, and from Zen. But as a psychologist, knowing that if I can help somebody go in and be with their parts that are suffering, the internal stuff that's happening, there is more freedom. So sometimes, and in this psychology world, there's that term of spiritual bypass. And so I struggle with, what am I doing here? So any help you could give, that would be great. Thank you. Deep bows.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember when I started Zen practice a long time ago in Hawaii, you know, I think most of us at that time had the idea that if you just sat hard enough and long enough, that, you know, somehow your psychological issues would become clarified and you let go of your traumas and all of that. And I think we've let go of that delusion a long time ago now. I think one of the wonderful things about the way that sort of Western psychology has interacted with Zen and Buddhism generally is exactly what you pointed to, of the dangers of spiritual bypassing and the incredible value that can happen combining the meditation practice with psychological work. So that's just a long way of agreeing with you completely that Zen, I don't see that as a way. I mean, in some cases, especially when it's not very deep, you know, Zen practice may be sufficient. But when it's really deep trauma, I think often what's needed is deep psychological, various types of psychological practice. And if it can be done in combination with meditation, if it's a sympathetic psychologist, I see that as sort of ideal, as very, very powerful. So that would be my perspective. I think this is one of the ways the Buddhist tradition is changing in a good way as it comes to the modern world, as it comes to what we know now about psychology and trauma and all of that. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Important point. Yeah.
Hugh, can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Yes, David, thank you for your very good presentation. I appreciate it. I think it seems to me what you're saying presumes good intentions, right intentions, and I'm also reminded too that in the Zazen Wasan, Akun's chant in praise of Zazen, it presupposes observing the precepts, repentance and giving, the countless good deeds, the way of right living. So to me, I sat many retreats, and it seems to me what you started off with, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to free them all, has become my core precept, you could say, that is repeated many times and helped me through my own work in homeless shelters and in many other endeavors. So I just wondered if you might address this issue of developing right intentions, that it is not something that's automatic, but really has to be developed and cultivated.
So yeah, wow, all these great questions. I'm reminded of a story I was once heard about a Tibetan teacher, actually a Bon teacher rather than a Buddhist one, but they're not all that different, really. The student asked the teacher, you know, I know that it's really important to be compassionate, but you know, sometimes I just don't feel that compassion. It doesn't feel natural or genuine. What should I do? And the teacher laughed and said, do it anyway. Do it anyway. We pretend to be, we try to become the kind of person we want to be, you know, especially, you know, in the early stages of our practice, or maybe always, you know, our intentions usually aren't so simple. They're usually complex, and there's ego connected there, right? In terms of what I might want to get out of it personally. So it's not as though it's a simple matter of, what am I trying to say? I mean, I think it's accepting where we're at, that it's a matter of slowly introducing more compassionate motivations. And as we continue to do that, and as they become part of how we live in the world, as they become habitual, then that's how our sense of self changes. I'm also reminded of the story that when mandatory seatbelts were first introduced, I think back in the 50s, most people did not want to wear them because it was, you know, it's kind of a restraint of freedom, and they didn't like the government telling them what to do. But as they got in the habit of wearing them, after a while, guess what? People wanted to wear them. In other words, it's not always inside out. Sometimes it's outside in the sense of the behavior, which we do whether we feel like it or not. The behavior is transformative. It'll transform us. It'll transform our minds and our intentions and our ways of thinking just by creating these replacing our usually self-preoccupied concerns, what's in it for me, as I said, with, you know, slowly trying to be more and more concerned about, you know, what's going on with other people. So I see it as a gradual path of sort of transformation in that way. But does that really answer your question, Hugh, or have I missed something there?
It's answered it to some extent, but I think good intentions, deep right intentions, have to be cultivated at all kinds of levels. So, but you certainly made a very good attempt. Thank you very much.
And I would agree completely. You know, intentions, they have to be cultivated, and you know, we cultivate them not just in our minds, but what we actually do is the cultivation too. I also remember Bhikkhu Bodhi once saying, you know, he was talking about people going on a metta retreat where they would go off by themselves and they would, you know, create metta, good feeling, compassion for other people. And then when the retreat was over, they would just go home and live the same way that they were before. And he would say, hey, wait a minute, something's missing here. You know, it's like if we cultivate metta in our heads, in our way of thinking, I mean, no, it's supposed to transform how we relate to other people. And so that kind of reciprocal thing, changing our minds, changing how we actually live, that back and forth is really important. Anyway, thank you for that question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let us now prepare for chanting.
Harmful karma ever committed by me since of old, on account of my beginningless greed, anger, and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and consciousness, now I atone it all. The four vows of the Bodhisattva. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Illusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Illusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. The Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. All rest throughout space and time. All honored ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha, Prajna,
I would like to thank everyone for being here today, and especially thank David for really opening his heart to us, where you are in your Zen journey and where you have seen how this Zen practice can be a way for us to contribute in healing our wounded earth. And each one of us has our own capacity to be part of that, an agent of that. So we thank you wholeheartedly for this, David.
Thank you, David. Few announcements. Next Saturday, we will not be meeting since it's July the 4th. And our next meeting will be Wednesday. I just wanted to acknowledge some people who are here for the first time. Jim, the husband of Cheryl, and then we have Eloisa Pilapil from the Philippines. And then Susan Karen, wife of Hugh. Mary Ellen, who's back. Mark Grace, but I can't see him. And then Todd, who's here for the first time. And John Leroy's wife. John, what is your wife's name? I'm sorry.
This is Donna.
Donna, yeah, welcome. So we will exit again. We just bow to one another and we will exit quietly.